The sun was a hammer on an anvil of red rock. Chaitin Co moved with the silence of a shadow, his moccasins making no sound on the baked clay that crumbled along the banks of the Black River. He was not called the Apache King by his own people. That was a name given to him by the white men in the scattered towns, a name spoken with a mix of fear and a grudging respect they would never admit to the Mimbreno. He was just Chaitin, the one who listened, the one who carried the weight of their thirst on his shoulders. And they were all thirsty. The river, usually a muscular artery of life through this arid land, was a withered vein. Its flow was weak, exposing pale stones that had not seen the sun in a generation. The cottonwoods drooped, their leaves yellowed before their time. Even the buzzards, circling high in the merciless blue, seemed to move with a weary slowness. This was the third month of the dry season, a season that felt as though it might last forever, choking the life from the land and his people. He was scouting for a sign, any sign, of a shift in the water, a new spring, or a threat. The greatest threat now wore trousers and carried surveyor's tools, and it belonged to a man named Silas Caldow. It was then he heard it, a sound so alien in this place of stoic survival it stopped him cold. It was the sound of weeping, not the wail of grief for the dead, a sound he knew too well, but a broken, hiccuping sob of utter despair. He followed the sound, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. Caution was a part of his bones. The sound led him around a bend in the river, to a small cove shaded by a single, stubborn mesquite. There, on the cracked earth, sat a woman, or rather, a girl who had been forced into the shape of one. She was dressed in what had once been an expensive white wedding gown. Now, the lace at its hem was torn and stained with red dust and darker, crimson blossoms of blood. Her hair, the color of corn silk, had escaped its careful arrangement and fell in tangled strands around her face. Her back was to him, her shoulders shaking with each sob. She was a ghost, a dream of a different world dropped carelessly into his own. For a long moment, he simply watched, a silent observer of this impossible sight. The Apache King, they called him, had found a lost bride crying by the river. He made a small sound, the scuff of a moccasin on stone, enough to announce himself without startling her too much. She gasped and spun around, scrambling backward like a cornered fawn. Her eyes were blue, swollen and red from crying, but wide with a fierce terror. He saw the way she looked at him, at his dark hair held back by a simple leather band, at his buckskin leggings and the hawk feather tied in his hair. She saw the stories she had been told, the nightmares whispered in the dark of wagon trains. He held up an empty hand. "I will not harm you," he said. His voice was low, the English words deliberate. The girl, Claire McKenna, stared at him. She had been running for 2 days, fueled by a terror that was colder and sharper than the one she felt now. The fear of a cage was worse than the fear of the wilderness. She swallowed, her throat raw. "Who are you?" "My name is Chaitin." He did not offer the title the white men gave him. It meant nothing here. He gestured with his chin toward her ruined dress, her bare, bleeding feet. "You are far from any church." A fresh wave of shame washed over her. She pulled the torn fabric of her skirt over her feet, a useless gesture of modesty. "I was to be married," she whispered, the words tasting like ash, "to Colt Caldow." The name struck Chaitin like a physical blow. Caldow, the nephew of the man who was strangling this river, the man building a great dam upstream, claiming the water for his railroad, his towns, his ambition. Claire saw the flicker in his eyes. "You know the name." It was not a question. She reached into a small satin bag that was still looped around her wrist, the last remnant of her bridal attire. She pulled out a piece of thick, embossed paper, ripped in half, a wedding invitation, and something else, something that glinted in the harsh light, a small ring of keys. "This marriage," she said, her voice gaining a thin thread of strength. It was not about love. It was a contract. My father is a foreman for Silas Caldau. This union was to be a seal, a public show of loyalty. Her gaze dropped to the cracked earth. But it was more. It was a lie to secure his grip on this valley. Silas Caldau has papers. Deeds, he says, were signed by your leaders, giving him rights to the headwaters of this river. Chayton remained silent, his face an unreadable mask, but his mind was racing. He knew of these papers. His uncle had spat on the ground at the mention of them, swearing no Mimbreno chief had ever touched the pen that signed away their lifeblood. They are forgeries, Claire said, looking up at him now, her blue eyes blazing with a sudden fire. My intended, Colt, he is a vain man. He boasts. He told me the real deeds, the ones showing the land was never sold, are locked away. He said the papers they show everyone are a work of art, enough to fool any judge in the territory. She held up the keys. They were small, ornate, made of brass. These were on his belt. He kept them with him always. I believe they open the safe where he keeps the truth. She had run not just from a loveless marriage, but from being an accomplice to a great theft. The shame she felt was not for her torn dress or her flight, but for the part she had almost played. The weight of it had crushed her, bringing her to her knees by this dying river. Chayton looked from the keys in her hand to the vast, empty landscape around them. She was telling the truth. He could feel it in the simple, desperate way she spoke. But her truth was a firebrand tossed into a powder keg. Helping her meant inviting the full wrath of Silas Caldau down upon his people, a war they could not afford to fight. Yet, to turn away felt like a betrayal of the very land he stood upon. As he weighed his choices, a new glint appeared on the horizon. Far downriver, it was the sun reflecting off something metal, a rifle barrel, a badge, a posse. He saw the faint cloud of dust their horses kicked up. They were still miles away, but they were coming. Claire followed his gaze, and a new panic seized her. It's him. It must be. Sheriff Harlan Pike. He works for the Caldaus, same as everyone else in Redemption Ridge. Her voice broke. Please, she begged, scrambling to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain as she put weight on them. They will not just take me back. They will make sure I am silenced. Please, just get me across the river. Take me somewhere safe. You can have the keys. They are of no use to me if I am caught, but they could be of use to you. They could save this river. She was no longer just a runaway bride. She was a bargainer. She was offering him the one thing he could not ignore, a chance. A dangerous, almost impossible chance. But a chance nonetheless. He looked at her, standing there in her ruined finery, a figure of profound contradiction. She was the daughter of his enemy, yet she offered the seeds of their salvation. The deep-seated distrust he held for her kind warred with a pragmatic need to seize any weapon he could find. He thought of the elders, their faces lined with worry. He thought of the children with their hollowed eyes. The river is treacherous, he said, his voice flat. It was not an agreement, but it was not a refusal. I do not care, she said. I would rather drown in it than be dragged back there. He gave a short, sharp nod. The decision was made. The risk to his people was immense, but the risk of doing nothing was greater. It was the slow death of thirst. He moved to the riverbank, testing the ground with his foot. The water was low, but it moved with a deceptive speed in the main channel. He pointed. We cross there. The current is slower. As he helped her limp toward the crossing, the sky, which had been a clear, relentless blue all day, began to change. Dark clouds, bruised and heavy, were gathering over the distant peaks. A sudden wind whipped down the canyon, carrying the scent of rain and wet dust, the first sign of the summer monsoons. They were halfway to the chosen spot when the sound began, a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it came from the earth, not the sky. Chayton froze, his head cocked. He had heard this sound before. He grabbed Claire's arm, his grip like iron. Run! But there was nowhere to run. The rumble grew into a roar. Upstream, a wall of brown, Churning water was racing down the dry riverbed, a flash flood born from a storm miles away in the mountains. It devoured the narrow channel, carrying with it debris, branches, and the fury of a reawakened river. The banks, weakened by the drought, began to crumble and fall away in great chunks. There was no time to think. The posse was behind them. The flood was before them. Chayton did the only thing he could. He swept Claire off her feet and into his arms. She cried out, startled, as he plunged into the rising water. The current slammed into them, cold and violent. He fought for purchase on the shifting riverbed, his legs straining against the force. The water was a living thing, trying to tear her from his grasp, trying to pull them both under. He held her tight against his chest, her face buried in his shoulder, and pushed onward. For a few terrifying moments, the world was nothing but the roar of the water and the desperate struggle for each step. Then, his feet found solid ground on the far side. He scrambled up the muddy bank, not stopping until they were safe among a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves now trembling in the rain-flecked wind. He set her down gently. She was shaking, soaked to the bone, but alive. Below them, the Black River was a raging torrent, a brown monster that had erased every trace of their footprints, every sign of their crossing. On the far side, the posse had arrived, their horses rearing at the edge of the impassable flood. For now, they were safe. Chayton looked down at the woman beside him. Her shame and fear were gone, replaced by a stunned awe. She was no longer crying. In that violent crossing, a threshold had been passed. He had taken her burden, and she had given him a key. A door had been opened between them, and neither of them knew where it would lead. The floodwaters receded as quickly as they had come, leaving behind a slick of dark mud and a river that was once again merely a shadow of its former self. But it had served its purpose. Sheriff Pike and his men were gone from the opposite bank, forced to seek a crossing miles downstream. For the moment, Claire and Chayton were alone, shrouded in the damp air of the coming storm. The fine wedding dress was a sodden, muddy ruin, clinging to her skin. Chayton stripped off his buckskin overshirt, leaving him in a simple linen tunic. He handed the shirt to her. It was worn soft with use and smelled of wood smoke and the dry earth. "It will be cold when the wind rises," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. She took it, her hands trembling slightly, and pulled the heavy, damp buckskin on over her wet clothes. It was a strange sort of armor, but it was warm. He led them away from the river, into a labyrinth of red rock and thorny scrub. The land was brutal, unforgiving, but he moved through it with a quiet confidence that was a balm to her frayed nerves. He found a small overhang of rock to shelter them from the initial squall of rain, and when it passed, he produced a pair of worn moccasins from a pouch on his belt. They were too large for her, but he showed her how to stuff the toes with dry grass for a better fit. The soft leather was a blessing on her cut and bruised feet. They walked for hours, Chayton setting a steady pace that ate up the miles without exhausting her. He taught her to walk as he did, placing her feet carefully, heel to toe, to leave as little sign as possible. She was a quick study, driven by the fresh memory of the hunters on her trail. By late afternoon, he stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. He pointed to a distant mesa, where a wisp of smoke, thin as a spider's thread, curled into the sky. "A cook fire," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Too small for a camp. A single scout. Pike is not a man who gives up easily. He has men fanned out, looking for any sign of us." That night, they made a cold camp in a shallow arroyo, a dry wash that offered some protection from the wind. They ate jerky and dried berries Chayton provided, the silence between them filled by the vastness of the star-dusted sky. Claire watched him as he sat observing the darkness, his stillness like that of the rocks around them. He was not the savage of the stories. He was a man burdened by a great weight, and she had just added herself to it. The next day, they moved north, toward the jagged line of the Dragoon Mountains. As they navigated a passage between two towering sandstone pillars, Chayton's horse, a sturdy Mustang the color of dried blood, shied at a snake. Chayton soothed the animal with a few quiet words in his own tongue. Without thinking, Claire responded softly, "Be calm, little brother. There is no danger." Chayton turned to look at her. His expression of surprise was the most emotion she had yet seen on his face. "You speak the language of my people." She felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Only a few words. I was very young. My father worked on a survey crew near a trading post. There were Apache families who would come to trade. A woman. She was kind to me. She taught me some words. Water, horse, friend. Thank you." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching. The world was divided into two simple camps for most people, his and hers, but here was a woman who blurred the line, who carried a few of his words in her memory. It was a small thing, a crack in the wall of his own prejudice. That evening, he deemed it safe enough for a fire, a small one tucked deep in a rock alcove, built with dry wood that would burn with little smoke. The small flames pushed back the immense darkness and the chill of the high desert night. It was in the flickering firelight that they began to trade more than just words. "The men who hunt us," Chayton said, his eyes on the flames, "they are not just lawmen. Pike hires scouts, men who know the land, men who will work for whiskey and coin and ask no questions." He paused, his jaw tightening. "My father's brother was killed by such men, not in a fight. They came upon his camp. He was hunting. They wanted his horse and his rifle. They did not see a man. They saw something less." He picked up a small stone, his fingers turning it over and over. "The white man fights big wars, with soldiers and flags, but we have been dying in 1,000 small wars that no one ever names." The quiet confession hung in the air. Claire thought of her own past, so different and yet so similar in its landscape of loss. "I am from Ireland," she said softly. "Or my parents were. We came to America to escape the hunger, but hunger is a patient hunter. It followed us here." She described the crowded, filthy tenements of New York, the endless search for work, the gnawing emptiness in her belly that was a constant companion. "My father took Mr. Caldow's offer to come west because it promised land and a steady wage. He believed he was saving us. He believed he was giving me a future. He does not see the cage, only the golden bars." Chayton looked at her, and, for the first time, he saw not a runaway bride from a world of wealth and privilege, but a fellow survivor. Her cage may have been gilded, but it was a cage nonetheless. Their lives were two different stories of the same struggle, the fight against being erased by the powerful. They were breaking camp the next morning when a rider appeared, materializing from the shimmering heat haze. He was not one of Pike's men. He was native, but his dress was a mix of Paiute leggings and a worn United States Army jacket. He rode a lean Appaloosa that picked its way through the rocks with an easy grace. "Chayton," the rider said, his voice raspy. He dismounted, his movements economical and sure. "I heard you had company." "Jonah," Chayton replied, a hint of relief in his tone. "Your ears are as sharp as ever." He introduced him as Jonah Two Feathers. Jonah's dark eyes rested on Claire, taking in her strange attire of a buckskin shirt and the tattered remains of a white skirt. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, not judgment. "The word is that Caldow's whelp lost his bride. Pike is turning over every rock between here and the border to find her. He's offering a reward that would make a poor man rich and a rich man a king." They traveled together, Jonah's presence adding another layer of security. His knowledge of the terrain was as deep as Chayton's. He led them toward a shortcut, a narrow slot canyon that would shave a day off their journey to Redemption Ridge, the town that lay in the Caldow's shadow. The canyon was a winding passage of stone, the walls so close in places they could touch both sides at once. It was in this claustrophobic space that two men with rifles stepped out from behind a bend. They were not lawmen. They were hard cases, the kind of men who drifted to the frontier because their pasts were unwelcome elsewhere. "Well, look what we have here. Billy!" the taller one said with a grin that showed several missing teeth. "The king himself, and it looks like he found the little lost princess." Chayton moved slightly, placing himself between them and Claire. Jonah's hand drifted toward the pistol on his hip. "You are a long way from any friends." "Pike's dogs," Chayton said, his voice cold as canyon stone. "The sheriff pays well," Billy said, raising his rifle. "Does not matter to us if we bring the girl back breathing or not." Before he could finish the sentence, a rock clattered from high above. Everyone looked up. In that split second of distraction, Chayton lunged forward, not at the men, but at the canyon wall. He slammed his shoulder into a section of loose scree, and a cascade of rocks and sand poured down, creating a screen of dust and noise. Jonah fired his pistol once, the shot echoing like a cannon in the narrow space. He did not aim to hit, but to startle. The two men, blinded and confused, stumbled back. It was all the time they needed. Chayton grabbed Claire's hand and they ran, following Jonah deeper into the winding canyon until they emerged, breathless, into the open sun. Their relief was short-lived. The sky to the west had turned a sickly yellow-brown. A monstrous cloud was boiling on the horizon, a moving wall of red dust. A storm was coming. Jonah led them to a shallow cave he knew of, and they huddled inside just as the first gust of wind hit, a physical blow that carried stinging sand. The world outside the cave dissolved into a howling, red twilight, huddled in the roaring darkness of the storm. Jonah looked at Claire, then at Chayton. "You need to know what you are riding into," he said, his voice raised over the wind. "I scouted for the army near the dam site. I have seen the survey map Silas Caldow keeps locked away. This dam is not just for his railroad. He is going to turn the Black River. All of it. He will create a new farming valley on that dry plain to the north and sell the land to settlers. Your people's land. Chayton. He will leave it as a wasteland." He turned to Claire. "Those papers you mentioned. The forgeries. There is more to it. There is an addendum. A separate document that gives him mineral rights, grazing rights, everything. It has the marks of chiefs who have been dead for 10 years. That is the real crime, and that is what he would kill to protect." He looked at the brass keys, which Claire clutched in her hand. "That is what those keys will unlock." The wind howled, throwing sand against the mouth of the cave. The truth of Silas Caldow's plan was as vast and suffocating as the storm outside. It was not just a theft of water, but the theft of a future. Later that afternoon, as they prepared to move on, Chayton's horse shifted its weight, revealing a long, deep gash on its hind leg from a sharp rock in the canyon. Blood oozed from the wound, without a word. Claire tore another long strip from her ruined dress. She soaked it from her canteen and gently began to clean the wound. Chayton watched her, his expression unreadable. She found some leaves from a plant he had pointed out earlier, one his people used to draw out infection, and crushed them into a paste. She applied it carefully and bound the leg with the makeshift bandage. When she was finished, she looked up and found him holding the reins of his horse. He showed her the intricate knot he used to secure the saddle cinch. "It must be tight," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "But not so tight it cuts the breath. A rider must trust his horse, and the horse must trust the rider." The dust storm had passed, leaving the air clean and the light sharp. In the distance, the mountains that cradled the town of Redemption Ridge were now clearly visible. The path ahead was dangerous, the enemy more powerful than she had imagined. But as she stood there, the feel of the horse's warm flank under her hand, she was not afraid. She was no longer a lost bride. She was a partner, and their journey had truly begun. Redemption Ridge announced itself first with sound, then with smell. Long before they saw the crude assortment of clapboard buildings, they heard the lonely cry of a train whistle echoing off the mountains. It was followed by the acrid scent of coal smoke and industry, a smell that was a profound offense to the clean, dry air of the mesas. The town was not born of the land. It had been surgically implanted upon it, A raw, open wound of progress. A massive water tower, painted with the name Condone in letters 10 feet high, loomed over everything. A monument to the man who owned the town, the railroad, and the water. Jonah led them in on a roundabout path, avoiding the main road, and they dismounted in a dusty livery stable that smelled of hay and horses, a familiar comfort in this alien place. Claire, still clad in the soft buckskin shirt and the remains of her dress, drew immediate, curious stares. But it was Chayton who drew the real attention. Men stopped their conversations, their eyes narrowing with suspicion and a hostility that was as much a part of the town's foundation as the timber frames of its buildings. He was a piece of the wilderness that had refused to be tamed, walking in their midst, and they did not like it. Jonah's plan was direct. There is a man, Parker, who runs the printing press for the local newspaper. He is a nervous little man, but he talks of truth and the power of the printed word. Perhaps he can be convinced to listen. They found the newspaper office tucked between a dry goods store and the assayer's office. The sign on the window read Redemption Ridge Clarion. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic smell of ink and lead. A small, balding man with ink stains on his fingers and a perpetually worried expression looked up from his work. This was Parker. Claire spoke, her voice clear and steady. She laid out the story. Not of her own flight, but of the fraudulent documents, of the plan to divert the entire river. She spoke of the Membreno people, of their right to the water, of the slow death Silas Caldow was inflicting upon the valley. Parker listened, his eyes darting toward the window as if expecting Silas Caldow himself to materialize on the boardwalk. When she finished, he licked his lips nervously. "Miss, that is a terrible story, a truly terrible story. But it is just that, a story, an accusation. I cannot print such things without proof. It would be libel. Mr. Caldow is a benefactor of this town. He built the railroad. He provides jobs. We will get you the proof," Chayton said, his voice low and resonant in the small room. Parker flinched as if he had been struck. He shook his head, refusing to meet Chayton's gaze. "I cannot. I am sorry. It would be my ruin." His cowardice was a palpable thing, a sour smell in the air. He had already chosen his side. Defeated, they stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, and it was there that Claire's past caught up with her. A gleaming black buggy, pulled by a perfectly matched pair of gray geldings, rolled to a stop in the street. The man holding the reins was handsome, dressed in a tailored suit of fine wool, his boots polished to a mirror shine. His smile was as bright and cold as a winter morning. It was Colt Caldow. "Well, now," Colt said, his voice carrying an easy, mocking charm. "I had heard a rumor that my dear bride had lost her way. I see she has found some rather unusual company." His eyes swept over Chayton with undisguised contempt before settling back on Claire. "My dear, this little adventure of yours has gone on long enough. It is time to come home. Your father is worried sick." "I am not your bride." "Colt," Claire said, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, "and I am not going anywhere with you." Colt's smile tightened at the edges. He swung down from the buggy, moving with a predator's grace. "Do not be foolish. You are making a scene. We had an agreement, a contract. Did you think you could just run away from that?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You will get in this buggy, and we will forget this unfortunate episode ever happened, or I will have my friend, the sheriff, escort your Apache guide to a cell. I am sure we can find something to charge him with. Trespassing, perhaps, or kidnapping." The threat was clear. He was using Chayton as a weapon against her. The townspeople who had gathered to watch the spectacle murmured amongst themselves. They saw a wealthy young man trying to reclaim his flighty bride from the clutches of a savage. The narrative was simple, powerful, and utterly false. It was Jonah who intervened. "I think the lady has made her wishes clear," he said, stepping forward. "Perhaps you should be on your way." Colt shot Jonah a look of pure venom. But before he could respond, another figure appeared, striding down the boardwalk. Sheriff Harlan Pike, a big man with a florid face and a silver badge that seemed to catch and magnify the sun's glare. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Caldow?" Pike asked, though his eyes were fixed on Chayton. "Just a misunderstanding, Sheriff," Colt said smoothly. "My fiancée is a little overwrought. I am taking her home." "No," Claire said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised even herself. "I am not." Pike's hand rested on the butt of his pistol. "Ma'am, maybe you should listen to Mr. Caldow, for everyone's sake." The street was a stage, and they were the unwilling actors in a play written by the Caldows. Just as the tension was about to snap, a new voice cut through the air, rich and musical. "Gentlemen, must you conduct your business in the street and frighten away my customers?" A woman stood in the swinging doors of the largest saloon in town, the Gilded Cage. She had dark, upswept hair, intelligent eyes, and a confidence that seemed to push back against the oppressive authority of Pike and Caldow. This was Rosa Valdez. Jonah had spoken of her, a woman who had carved out her own small empire of whiskey and cards and who bowed to no one. "Rosa," Pike said, his tone shifting slightly, "this does not concern you." "Everything that happens on my doorstep concerns me," she replied, her gaze moving from the sheriff to Claire. "Young lady, you look like you could use a cool drink of water. Come inside, on the house." It was an invitation and a command. She held the door open. Seeing no other choice, Claire walked toward the saloon. Chayton and Jonah followed, the eyes of the entire town on their backs, inside. The saloon was dark and cool. Rosa led them to a back room, away from the curious eyes of the few daytime drinkers. "You have made some powerful enemies," Rosa said, pouring 3 glasses of water from a pitcher, "and some very foolish ones. Colt Caldow is a peacock, all feathers and strut, but his uncle is a snake, and Pike is his fang." She looked at Jonah. "You bring trouble to my door, old friend." "We had nowhere else to go," Jonah said. Rosa's sharp gaze softened as she looked at Claire. "I have no love for the Caldows. Silas squeezed my late husband out of a freight business that was rightfully his. I pay my taxes and I keep my peace, but I do not forget." She confirmed what Jonah had suspected. The safe was in the office of the Black River Dam and Rail Company, a brick building right next to the train station. It is the heart of his entire operation. He controls the flow of information with the telegraph and the flow of goods with the train. The man is a spider in the center of a very large web. As they spoke, the front doors of the saloon burst open. "Pike's men," Rosa said, her expression hardening. "He has surrounded the place. He is not going to let you just walk out of here." She moved to a large, dusty tapestry on the wall depicting a Spanish bullfight. She pulled it aside, revealing a heavy wooden door. My husband was a practical man. He did not always trust the banks or the law. She unlocked the door, revealing a flight of stone steps leading down into darkness. "This leads to the old bootleggers' tunnels. They run under half the town. This one comes out in the cellar of the old mission. At the edge of town, go, now." They plunged into the cool, musty darkness of the tunnel. It was narrow and low, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and aging secrets. Chayton lit a small stub of a candle he carried, its flickering light throwing their shadows, distorted and huge. Against the stone walls, they moved in single file, the only sounds their footsteps and the dripping of water somewhere in the darkness. It was in this confined, subterranean world that Claire finally broke the silence, the weight of her compromise. The truth she had been carrying became too heavy to bear alone. "The wedding," she said, her voice a near whisper in the dark. "It was not just for my father's job, it was to pay a debt." Chayton stopped and turned, his face illuminated by the candle flame, his expression patient, waiting. "When we came from New York, Silas Caldow paid for our passage. He paid for our tools, our homestead, our lives. We were indentured to him. In a way. My father has worked for years, but the interest, the cost of things, it always grew. We were sinking. The marriage to Colt, it was to be the final payment. It would have wiped the slate clean. My freedom in exchange for my family's. She looked at him, her eyes pleading for an understanding she was not sure she deserved. She had been bought and sold, a willing participant in the transaction out of love and desperation for her family. She had almost become a part of the Caldo empire, another asset to be leveraged. Chayton listened, his face impassive, but his eyes held a deep, ancient sadness. He understood the nature of debt. His people were in a debt they could never repay, a debt of land and life. He looked at this young woman, who had been caught in a different kind of trap, one made of loyalty and poverty. He reached out, not to touch her, but to steady the flickering candle. The small flame grew brighter, pushing back the oppressive dark. "The debt of one person," he said, his voice quiet but as solid as the rock walls around them, "cannot be paid with the water of an entire people." The words were not an absolution, nor were they a condemnation. They were a simple, profound truth. They hung in the silent darkness of the tunnel, clarifying everything. Her personal tragedy was a part of a much larger one. Her choice to run had not just been about her own freedom, but about something far greater. When they finally emerged from the cellar of the ruined mission, blinking in the late afternoon sun, the town of Redemption Ridge lay behind them, but they were no longer just running from it. They now had a target, the brick building by the railroad tracks, the safe. Claire's resolve had hardened from a desperate flight into a focused purpose, and Chayton, who had sought only to protect his people, now saw that the only path to safety was not through avoidance, but through confrontation. The proof was in that safe, and they would find a way to get it. The journey into the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains was a journey into a different world, the raw scar of Redemption Ridge, with its smokestacks and rigid streets, gave way to a landscape that was ancient and alive. Chayton led Claire not to a village of tents and lean-tos, as the stories in the white world described, but to a hidden encampment nestled in a shallow canyon, protected from the wind and the prying eyes of outsiders. It was a place of deep roots, of families who had lived on this land since the beginning of memory, but it was a place in pain. The first thing Claire noticed was the silence. It was not the peaceful quiet of the open mesas, but a heavy, listless quiet. Children who should have been running and shouting sat in the shade of the wickiups, their movements slow, their eyes large in their thin faces. Women moved with a weary economy of motion, their shoulders slumped. The source of the silence, the source of the sorrow, was at the center of the camp. It was the well. It was not a well in the way Claire understood it, with a stone wall and a bucket on a rope. It was a natural spring, a place where the life of the earth bubbled to the surface, but the earth was dying. The spring was little more than a muddy seep, and the ground around it was a spider web of deep, thirsty cracks. An old woman knelt by the edge, carefully scooping a trickle of water into a clay pot. She looked up as Chayton and Claire approached, her eyes dark and cloudy with age, fixing on Claire. There was no welcome in them, only a profound and weary suspicion. Claire felt a wave of guilt so powerful it almost buckled her knees. This was not an abstract injustice she had read about in a Boston newspaper. This was the face of it. These were the people whose water was being stolen to secure her family's comfort, to wash away a debt she had agreed to pay. The buckskin shirt she wore felt like a costume, a mockery of the life she was witnessing. That night, the men of the camp gathered around a central fire. The flames danced, casting long shadows that writhed like troubled spirits. Claire sat on the periphery, an outsider permitted to watch but not to participate. A young warrior, his face a mask of impatient anger, rose to speak. His name was Taza, and his voice was sharp with contempt. "We wait," Taza said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled men before landing on Chayton. "We wait, and we watch our children grow weak. We listen to the wind. and it brings us no rain, only the sound of the white man's hammer building his dam. The time for talking is over. The time for waiting for papers and promises is over. We should strike, a raid. We destroy the dam, and the water will return." A murmur of agreement ran through some of the younger men. They were tired of being cautious. They wanted a fight they could understand, a physical enemy they could strike. Chayton let the murmurs die down before he rose. He did not raise his voice. He did not meet Taza's anger with his own. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had considered all the paths and had chosen the hardest one. "A raid would feel good," he began, his voice calm and steady. "For a day, for a week, we might break the dam, and the water would flow again, for a time. But then what the army would come, not just Pike and his hired guns, but the soldiers from Fort Bowie. They would call us hostiles. They would hunt us down, and they would not stop until they had killed or captured every one of us. We would win the water and lose our people. Is that a victory you wish to give your sons?" He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Anger is a fire that burns hot and fast. It leaves only ashes. Justice is a seed. It must be planted in the right soil, and it must be protected. The white man respects only one thing, his own law, his own paper. This woman, he gestured toward Claire, not with accusation, but as a statement of fact, has given us a key to a piece of paper that can prove the theft. With that proof, we do not fight a battle. We win the war. We secure the water not for a season, but for all the seasons to come. That is a victory I will give to my sons." His logic was a cool stream on the hot coals of their anger. Taza sat down, his face still tight with frustration, but the fire had gone out of the other men's eyes. They saw the wisdom in Chayton's path, even if they chafed at its slowness. Claire watched him, a new understanding dawning. He was not just a guide, he was a leader, navigating a treacherous passage between rage and survival, holding the future of his people in his steady hands. 2 days later, Jonah. Two Feathers rode into the camp. He brought news, and none of it was good. He found Chayton and Claire as they were checking the poultice on Chayton's horse. "Pike has sent his message," Jonah said. "Swinging down from his Appaloosa, he did not need to elaborate. His face was grim. He could not touch you, so he went after Rosa. He burned her livery stable to the ground last night. All of it, a warning to anyone else in Redemption Ridge who might think of offering you aid." Claire felt a sick lurch in her stomach. The fire was meant for them. Rosa, who had been so kind, so strong, was paying the price for their escape. The web of the Caldow's power was far-reaching, and it was woven with violence. But Jonah had not come only with bad news. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a railroad freight schedule. "Pike is getting nervous. So is Caldow. They are moving things. This schedule shows a special, unscheduled train leaving Redemption Ridge in 3 days. It is a single car, with a guard contingent. It is heading east. They are moving the safe." The news sent a jolt of urgency through them. Their target was no longer stationary. It was about to slip through their fingers. As they began to discuss a plan, to formulate a way to intercept the train, a boy from the camp ran up to them, his eyes wide. A rider was approaching, a white man. He was alone, and he carried a white cloth tied to a stick, a truce flag. Chayton and several warriors went to meet him. The rider was a trapper, a grizzled man whose face was a roadmap of hard years. He said he had been paid to deliver a message. He held out a sealed envelope. It was addressed simply to Claire. Her hands trembled as she took it. The handwriting was her father's. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The words swam before her eyes. It was short, the sentences jagged with what seemed to be grief and panic. Her mother, it said, her mother had fallen gravely ill with a fever. The doctor said she did not have long. She was calling for her. "Please, daughter." It ended, "Come home. Your mother needs you." The world tilted on its axis. Her mother, her gentle, quiet mother, who had endured so much, who had followed her husband across an ocean and a continent, was dying. And she was here, in the wilderness, a fugitive. The guilt she had felt at the well was nothing compared to this. This was a spear through the heart. "I have to go back," she said, the words a choked whisper. She looked at Chayton, her eyes pleading. "I have to—" "It is a trap," Chayton said, his voice flat. "You do not know that," she cried, clutching the letter to her chest. "This is my mother. I cannot let her die alone while I am out here playing at being a hero. My family, they are all I have. The old debt, the old loyalty. It was a chain around her ankle, pulling her back. The plight of Chayton's people, the fight for the river. It all faded before the powerful, primal call of family. "Think, Claire," Chayton said, his voice urgent but calm. "The timing. A special train is leaving. They want you back in Redemption Ridge before it does. They want the keys. Why does this letter arrive now?" "Because she is sick now," Claire shot back, tears streaming down her face. "Everything is not a conspiracy. It is my life." She turned and began to walk away, back toward the trail that led to the town, a blind, desperate need to go home overriding all reason. Chayton walked beside her, not trying to stop her, but not leaving her. "Your mother," he said quietly, his voice cutting through her haze of grief. "Was she a strong woman? Was her health good before you left?" The question stopped her. She turned to face him, a fresh wave of tears blurring his image. She was always frail. Since the crossing from Ireland, she had a lung sickness. The cold winters in New York were hard on her. Her voice trailed off. A memory, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her panic. A memory of a small, wind-swept cemetery on a hill outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania, where her father had worked for a time in the coal mines. A simple wooden cross, the smell of damp earth. "She died?" Claire whispered, the words catching in her throat. "She died 3 years ago. The fever took her in less than a week." She stared at the letter in her hand, this cruel, calculated piece of paper. It was not a message from her father. It was a ghost, summoned by Colt Caldau to haunt her, to manipulate her. The depth of his cruelty was a cold abyss. He had taken her most sacred loss and twisted it into a weapon. The strength went out of her legs. A strangled sob escaped her lips. She turned and ran, not toward the town, but away from the camp, away from Chayton, away from the pity she saw dawning in his eyes. She ran blindly, stumbling through the scrub and the rocks, until she found herself on the bank of a dry creek bed, a smaller tributary of the Black River. There, she fell to her knees in the dust and the cracked earth, and she wept. It was not the desperate, hopeless weeping of the lost bride he had found by the river. This was the sound of a heart breaking, of an illusion shattering. She cried for her mother, for the memory that had been so cruelly desecrated. She cried for her father, trapped in his own prison of debt and denial. And she cried with a rage that was new to her, a cold, clean fury at the man who would stoop so low, who would use love and grief as tools of control. When the tears finally subsided, she was not empty. She was filled with a hard, unyielding resolve. She looked up and saw Chayton standing a short distance away, watching over her, giving her the space she needed for her grief. He had known it was a lie, and he had trusted her to find the truth herself. He walked toward her and looked down at the cracked, thirsty earth of the creek bed, a mirror of the well in his own camp. "Anger is not enough to make the water flow again," he said, his voice quiet. "Justice needs more. It needs paper, and it needs people willing to speak the truth." Claire got to her feet, wiping the tear tracks from her dusty face. The guilt was gone, burned away. The last chain holding her to her old life had been broken, not by her own strength, but by her enemy's cruelty. She was no longer running from Colt Caldau. She was hunting him. "Then let us go get the paper," she said. Their new resolve was a shield against the cold wind that swept down from the high peaks. They traveled with a grim purpose. Jonah having ridden ahead to scout the train's route and find a place where they might have a chance. Chayton and Claire moved through the broken country that bordered the Black River, their path dictated by the need for cover. The anger that had fueled Claire had settled into a hard, dense core of determination. She was no longer looking over her shoulder for Pike's men. She was looking ahead, toward the confrontation she now welcomed. The sky, which had been a brilliant, unforgiving blue, began to haze over with a strange, pearly light. The air grew still and heavy, and a deep, penetrating cold seeped into their bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the coming night. Chayton stopped, his face turned to the sky, sniffing the air like an animal sensing a change in the season. "Something is wrong," he said. "The wind is coming from the north. It should not do this now." Within an hour, they knew what was wrong. The first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not the soft, gentle flakes of a winter's day, but small, hard pellets of ice that stung their exposed skin. It was a freak storm, a final, spiteful blast from a winter that should have long been dead. The temperature plummeted, the light faded to a disorienting gray twilight, and the snow began to fall in thick, blinding sheets. The landscape they had been navigating with such certainty dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. They were in danger, not from Pike's rifles, but from the land itself. The cold was a relentless enemy, stealing the warmth from their bodies, turning their hands and feet to numb blocks of wood. "There is a place," Chayton shouted over the rising howl of the wind. "An old trapper's cabin, not far from here. We must reach it." He took the reins of her horse, leading them into the teeth of the blizzard. It was a desperate, stumbling journey. The world was reduced to the back of Chayton's head, the ghostly shapes of the horses, and the suffocating whiteness all around. Claire lost all sense of time and direction, trusting only in the man who forged a path through the storm. Just when she felt she could go no further, that the numbing cold would claim her, a dark shape loomed out of the snow. A small, squat cabin, its roof heavy with a thick blanket of white. Chayton forced the swollen wooden door open, and they stumbled inside, out of the wind's merciless assault. The cabin was a single room, rough-hewn from pine logs, the gaps chinked with dried mud. A crude stone hearth dominated one wall, and a rickety table and a single bunk with a straw mattress were its only furnishings. It was a desolate, forgotten place, but at that moment, it was the most beautiful sanctuary in the world. While Claire fumbled with her numb fingers to tend to the horses in the small lean-to attached to the cabin, Chayton worked with a swift efficiency inside. He found a small pile of dry wood left by the last occupant and soon had a fire crackling in the hearth. The flames pushed back the gloom, and a fragile warmth began to spread through the small space. They huddled before the fire, soaking in its life-giving heat, the snow melting from their clothes and hissing on the warm stones of the hearth. The storm raged outside, a wild symphony of wind and ice, but within the four walls of the cabin, a profound silence fell. They were sealed off, adrift in a sea of white, their past and their future held at bay by the storm. He remembered the first time he had seen her, a lost bride crying by the river, a creature from another world. He had seen her as a complication, a danger to his people. Now, watching her in the soft, flickering firelight as she wrung the water from her hair, her face etched with a weariness that went deeper than the mere cold, he saw something else. He saw the strength she had discovered, the fire that had been forged in her flight. The Apache king found a lost bride crying by the river, and their forbidden love ignited in the cabin. The flame was not one of sudden passion, but of a slow, deep recognition, a warmth that had been growing between them since that first desperate river crossing. It was the quiet ignition of two souls who had found in each other a shelter from a storm far greater than the one howling outside. "You have a scar," she said softly, her voice little more than a whisper. She was looking at his shoulder, where the linen of his tunic had pulled aside, revealing a pale, jagged line against his dark skin. "A fight," he said simply. When I was young and foolish enough to think that my anger was a sharp enough weapon. I have them too, she said, her gaze dropping to her own hands. You just cannot see them. She spoke of the invisible wounds left by her past, the shame of her family's debt, the cold cruelty in Colt's forged letter. She laid her story bare before him, not as a confession, but as a sharing of burdens. He listened, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. When she was finished, he reached for a length of dried yucca fiber he carried in his pouch. His strong, deft fingers began to braid the strands together. A simple 3-strand plait. My mother taught me this, he said, his voice low. The yucca is strong. Its roots hold the earth together. Its leaves are sharp, a warning to those who would harm it. But its fibers, when they are woven together, create a bond that is stronger than any single strand. It is a promise of strength, of endurance. When he had finished, he held up a simple, braided bracelet. He took her wrist, his touch gentle, and tied the yucca bracelet around it. It was a simple, rustic thing, but it felt more real, more binding than any ring of gold or silver. She looked at the bracelet, then up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. It was a vow made in a forgotten cabin, witnessed only by the storm. My mother, he said, his gaze distant. She used to tell me that the water has a voice. She said if you sit by the river and listen, truly listen, you can hear the stories of the land. The water remembers the feel of the deep rocks, the thirst of the tree roots. It knows the heart of the world. He looked at Claire. I have spent my life listening for that voice, trying to understand what the land needs. Now, it needs its water back. The intimacy of the moment, the warmth of the fire, unlocked something in Claire. She found herself sharing a dream she had never spoken aloud to anyone, a fragile hope she had nurtured in the secret corners of her heart. When I was a girl, she began, I used to dream of having a school, not a grand one like they have back east, just a small room, a place where it did not matter if your father was Irish or your mother was Mexican or your people were Apache, a place where children could learn to read from the same book. She looked into the flames, a small, sad smile on her lips. It was a foolish dream for a girl whose family owed everything they had. It is not a foolish dream, Chayton said quietly. To teach a child is to plant a seed for a tree you may never see grow. It is a dream of a better future. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin, and with it came a new sound, a long, mournful howl that cut through the noise of the storm. Wolves. They were close, their hunting cry a stark reminder of the wild, hungry world that lay just beyond the cabin door. The sound sent a shiver through Claire, and she instinctively moved closer to the fire, closer to Chayton. He put a comforting hand on her arm, a simple gesture of protection that spoke volumes. It was then that she felt it, a wave of dizziness, followed by a sudden, churning nausea. She pressed a hand to her stomach, blaming it on the jerky they had eaten, the exhaustion of the journey. But as the feeling passed, a cold dread, more chilling than the storm, washed over her. She thought back over the past weeks. The constant stress, the running, had masked the signs. The weariness she had attributed to travel, the sickness in her stomach she had mistaken for fear, and the monthly cycle, a rhythm as old as time, that had not come. She was pregnant. The realization was not a joyful one. It was a terrifying, world-altering cataclysm. A child conceived in a world of chaos, a child with a white mother and an Apache father, a child who would be an outcast in both their worlds. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her belly. She looked at Chayton, who was watching the fire, his face calm and strong, and a new, fierce determination rose up to meet the fear. This was no longer just about justice for his people or freedom for herself. It was about the future, a tiny, vulnerable, unimaginable future that was now growing inside her. The safe, the papers, the dam. They were no longer just symbols of a righteous fight. They were the building blocks of a world where her child could be safe. The terror was a motivator, a force more powerful than anger or revenge. The storm began to subside with the first pale light of dawn. The wind's howl softened to a whisper, and a profound silence settled over the snow-covered world. Chayton opened the door, and they looked out on a landscape transformed, pristine and white, every sharp edge softened, every flaw hidden beneath a blanket of pure snow. They were no longer just companions on a desperate journey. The forgotten trapper's cabin had been a crucible. They had entered it as fugitives, allies bound by a common enemy. They emerged from it as partners, bound by a yucca promise and the terrifying, unspoken secret of a new life. They were no longer just running from the past. They were now fighting for a future. The world they returned to was one of stark, brilliant clarity. The snow had melted under the morning sun, leaving the air washed clean and the red rocks gleaming as if newly born. But the pristine beauty of the landscape could not hide the tension in the Membrano camp. They returned not just as leader and companion, but as two people altered by the intimacy of the storm. A subtle shift in the way they stood together, the glances that passed between them, on Claire's wrist. The simple yucca braid was a visible mark of this change. It did not go unnoticed. Taza, the young warrior whose anger burned like a stubborn coal, saw it immediately. To him, the bracelet was not a promise, but a betrayal. It was a sign that Chayton's judgment had been clouded by this white woman, this outsider who now wore a symbol of his people on her arm. He waited until they had eaten and Chayton was speaking with the elders. Then, with 3 other young men who shared his impatience, he approached Claire where she sat mending a tear in Chayton's buckskin shirt. They moved with a deliberate purpose, their shadows falling over her before they spoke. "You do not belong here," Taza said, his voice low and sharp. He gestured to the surrounding canyon. "You have seen our trails. You have slept by our fires. You know the location of this camp. Now you wear our symbols as if they were trinkets bought at a trading post." Claire stood up slowly, her heart pounding, but she refused to show her fear. "I mean your people no harm." "Your intentions mean nothing," another warrior sneered. "You are a risk. When your people come looking for you, they will follow your trail. You will lead them straight to us." "That is enough." "Taza!" Chayton's voice cut through the air, cold and hard as flint. He had emerged from his meeting with the elders and now stood a few feet away, his eyes fixed on Taza. "Is it?" Taza challenged, turning to face him. He was younger, taller, but he did not have Chayton's stillness. "You bring her into our heart. You trust her with our lives, with the lives of our children. And for what? A promise, the promise of a white woman who was to be married to our enemy. She weakens you. She weakens us." Before Chayton could answer, Taza and his men moved, not towards him, but towards Claire. They grabbed her arms, their grips firm but not yet brutal. "She will be taken to a place where her knowledge cannot harm us," Taza declared. Not to Claire, but to Chayton, a direct challenge to his authority. "She will be kept there until this is over. It is for the good of the people." Claire struggled, a cry of outrage on her lips, but their strength was overwhelming. Chayton took a step forward, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt, the muscles in his jaw bunching. The camp, which had been humming with quiet activity, fell silent. Everyone watched, waiting to see if the spark of conflict would erupt into flame. "Let her go." The voice was not Chayton's. It was thin and reedy, but it carried an authority that cut through the tension like a sharp blade. The old woman who had been at the well, the one whose eyes had held such deep suspicion, was walking toward them, leaning heavily on a staff of polished ironwood. Her name was Yatza, and she was the camp's healer, its keeper of stories. A woman whose wisdom was woven into the fabric of their lives. Taza and his men stopped, their hands still on Claire, but their certainty wavered. To defy Chayton was one thing. To defy Yatza was another entirely. Yatza stopped before them, her ancient, clouded eyes moving from the warriors' faces to Claire's. She looked at the fear in Claire's eyes, but she also saw the defiance. She saw the yucca bracelet on her wrist. "The boy is right," Yatsa said, her gaze returning to Taza. "You are a risk." She then turned her eyes to Chaitin. "And you are a fool to trust so easily." She paused, letting her words hang in the silent air. But the path of wisdom is not always the path of caution. Sometimes, it is the path of a calculated risk. She reached out a thin, wrinkled hand and touched the yucca bracelet on Claire's wrist. "This was not given lightly. I see the story in its weave." She looked back at Taza, her voice gaining strength. "You speak of protecting our trails. Chaitin seeks to protect our water. Which is the truer path to survival? Let her go. Her path is now tied to his. Let us see where it leads." Her words were a judgment. Taza hesitated for a long moment, his pride warring with a lifetime of respect for this woman. Finally, with a look of disgust, he released Claire's arm and stalked away, his followers trailing behind him like frustrated hounds. The reprieve was short-lived. A cry of alarm came from a nearby wickiup. A young woman was in labor with her first child, and things were not going well. Yatsa was immediately at her side, but soon a grim look settled on her face. The baby was not turned correctly. It was a difficult, dangerous birth. Claire, her own secret a cold weight in her belly, watched from a distance. She saw the fear on the young husband's face. She saw the strain in Yatsa's posture as the hours dragged on. She knew a little of these things, not from books, but from the hard-won knowledge of the poor. She had seen women in the tenements of her youth die in childbirth. She had seen her own mother help a neighbor whose baby had been similarly stuck. She approached the wickiup, her heart pounding. "Yatsi," she said softly from the entrance. The old woman looked up, her face slick with sweat. "There is a way. My mother showed me, to help turn the baby from the outside." Yatsa's eyes narrowed. "The white doctor's way?" "No," Claire said. "The women's way, the way of hands." Yatsa studied her for a long moment, then gave a sharp nod. "Show me." For the next hour, inside the dim, smoky wickiup, Claire worked alongside the old medicine woman. She showed her how to gently but firmly press on the mother's belly, how to feel for the baby's position and coax it into turning. She spoke words of encouragement to the laboring woman, her voice calm and steady. It was an act of profound intimacy and trust. Claire was no longer an outsider. She was just a woman, helping another woman through the oldest and most dangerous of passages. Finally, with a great cry from the mother, the baby was born, a healthy boy, his own lusty cries filling the small space. The relief was a palpable wave. The young father wept with joy. Yatsa, exhausted but triumphant, looked at Claire. The suspicion was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep and unwavering respect. Claire had not just offered knowledge. She had offered her hands, her heart. She had met a moment of crisis with action, not words. That evening, the mood in the camp was different. The story of the birth had spread like wildfire. People looked at Claire differently now, with curiosity and a dawning acceptance. The birth of the new baby was a powerful symbol, a sign of hope in a time of despair. Yatsa summoned Claire and Chaitin to the central fire. She held 2 more braided yucca bracelets in her hands, identical to the one Claire already wore. Taza and his followers watched from the shadows, their disapproval a silent, brooding presence. "The white men have their laws, written in books and sealed with wax," Yatsa said, her voice carrying in the still night air. "They have their ceremonies in buildings of wood and stone. We have the fire. We have the earth. We have the bonds that are woven by our own hands." She took Chaitin's wrist and tied one of the bracelets onto it, a mirror to the one Claire wore. Then she took a fresh bracelet and tied it onto Claire's other wrist. "This is not a marriage by their laws," she said, her voice ringing with an ancient authority. "But it is a binding, a promise made before the fire. You two walk one path now. Your sorrows are shared, your strengths are shared. Your future is one." It was a simple, profound act. There were no vows, no pronouncements, only the quiet tying of the fibers, a recognition of a truth that had been forged in a storm and proven in the crucible of birth. It was their community's way of saying they saw them, they accepted them. As the ceremony concluded, a rider galloped into the camp, his horse lathered and breathing hard. It was one of the scouts Chayton had posted to watch the dam. His face was a mask of grim urgency. "The dam," he said, his voice ragged. "They have closed the final gates. The river, it is a trickle. The fish are dying on the stones. I pass the herds from the town. The cattle are falling in the fields, their mouths open to a dry sky." A stunned silence fell over the camp. The threat was no longer a matter of weeks or months. It was now. The lifeblood of the valley was being cut off. Time had run out. Taza stepped out of the shadows, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and vindication. "You see," he shouted at Chayton, "your path of paper and patience has led us to this thirst while you weave bracelets. Our people are delivered to their deaths." But this time, his words did not find fertile ground. The people looked not at Taza, but at Chayton and Claire, standing together by the fire, their wrists bound by the yucca promises. They saw the newborn baby, a tangible symbol of a future they had almost lost. They understood now. The risk Chayton had taken was their only hope. The white woman was not their enemy. The keys she carried, the truth she held, were their only weapons. Chayton's quiet strength had held them on the right path, and now, at the moment of greatest crisis, they were ready to follow him. The news of the dam's closing fell upon the Mimbreno camp not like a thunderclap, but like the final, suffocating shovelful of dirt on a grave. The fight was no longer for a future right. It was for immediate survival. The quiet deliberations of the elders and the hot-blooded arguments of the young warriors merged into a single, grim purpose. There was no more debate, no more doubt. There was only the plan. They gathered that night, not around the large communal fire, but in the flickering shadows of Chayton's own wickiup. It was a council of war born of desperation. Chayton, Claire, Jonah, Two Feathers, and the wise, steady presence of Yatza. The air was thick with the scent of pinon smoke and the unspoken fear of what lay ahead. "The train is their lifeline," Jonah said, his voice a low rasp. He had already been tracing its path in the dust with a stick. "It brings their supplies, their men, their connection to the power in the east. The safe will be on that train. To strike at it is to strike at Kaldau's heart." "But the station is a fortress," Chayton countered, his eyes fixed on the crude map in the dirt. "Pike's men will be everywhere. To attack there would be a slaughter." "We will not attack the station," Jonah said. A hawk-like smile briefly touched his lips. "I have a friend who owes me a favor, a woman with a long memory and no love for Silas Kaldau." 2 days later, Jonah returned. He met them at a prearranged spot, a cluster of sun-bleached boulders miles from the camp. He carried with him a rolled-up sheet of canvas. He spread it on the ground, revealing a detailed, hand-drawn diagram. It was a map of the Redemption Ridge train station, but it showed more than the public buildings. It showed a network of cellars and service tunnels, a hidden underworld beneath the town's bustling facade. "From Rosa," Jonah explained. "She says the main tunnel leads from the old mission directly into the station's freight depot cellar. Her husband used it to move goods without the railroad taking a cut. It is a ghost passage. No one has used it in years." He also brought another, more critical piece of intelligence. While waiting for the diagram, he had lingered in the shadows near the gilded cage, his ears open. He had overheard 2 of Pike's deputies, their tongues loosened by Rosa's whiskey. They spoke of the special train. They were not just moving the forged land deeds. Silas Kaldau, paranoid after Claire's escape, was clearing out the entire office safe. They mentioned a company ledger, a book where Silas recorded every transaction, every payment made in the territory. "They called it his memory book," Jonah said, his eyes glinting. "They laughed about how if that book ever saw the light of day, Men like Sheriff Pike and Parker the printer would swing from their own telegraph poles. A new electric tension filled the air. This changed everything. They were not just chasing a legal document. They were hunting the key to unraveling Caldow's entire criminal enterprise. The land deeds could save the river. The ledger could cleanse the valley. With this new information, the plan began to take shape, piece by dangerous piece. The target was no longer the station, but the train itself, once it was in motion, once it was vulnerable. "There is a place," Chayton said, his finger tracing a line on a map he carried in his head. 10 miles east of the town, the tracks crossed the Diablo Canyon on a wooden trestle bridge. The grade is steep on the approach. The train must slow to a crawl to make the climb safely. The image was stark and terrifying. A skeletal bridge of timber and steel, suspended hundreds of feet above a rocky chasm. It was a place on the edge of the world, a thin line between the earth and the empty air, a place where there could be no easy retreat. We stopped the train on the bridge. Chayton continued, his voice steady. "Jonah, you will handle the talking wire. We need silence. No messages reaching the next town until we are clear." Jonah nodded. "I can cut the line 5 miles east of the bridge. It will look like a natural break from a fallen tree. It will buy us at least 2 hours. The rest of us will be waiting," Chayton said, his gaze sweeping over the small group of warriors he had selected, men who were loyal and steady, including, to everyone's surprise, Taza, the young warrior, humbled by Yatza and sobered by the imminent threat, had offered his rifle, his anger now honed to a sharp, disciplined edge. "We do this with a purpose. We are not thieves. We are not murderers. We take the safe. That is all. No blood will be spilled unless we are forced." While the men prepared their weapons and planned their approach, Claire faced her own part of the battle. She sat in the quiet of the afternoon. A stack of precious paper obtained by Jonah and a pen filled with ink before her. Her weapon was not a rifle, but words. She was not just a runaway bride anymore. She was a witness. She was the bridge between two worlds, and she began to write. She drafted a statement, a clear, concise proclamation addressed not to the local, compromised Clarion, but to the great newspapers of the East. She wrote of the contract her family had been forced into, of the fraudulent deeds Colt had boasted of the systematic theft of water from a people who had lived on the land for 1,000 years. She did not write with flowery, emotional language. She wrote with the cold, hard precision of an accountant, laying out the facts, the names, the dates. She was building a case, not for a dusty courtroom in the territory, but for the court of public opinion, a power that even Silas Caldow feared. When she was finished, the document was a clean, sharp indictment of the rot that festered in Redemption Ridge. She folded it carefully, ready to be sent with copies of the documents from the safe, a package of truth that would explode like a bomb in the parlors and offices of the East. The day before the train was due to depart, a new element of danger entered their calculations. A faint haze appeared on the northern horizon, and the wind carried a scent that every inhabitant of the dry lands knew and feared, the distant smell of a forest fire. It was miles away, a plume of smoke staining the otherwise perfect blue sky. But it was a wild card, a force of nature that answered to no man's plan. A shift in the wind could turn the distant threat into an inferno, and their chosen battlefield, the wooden trestle bridge, would become a funeral pyre. The tension in the final hours was a palpable thing. The warriors cleaned their rifles, their movements spare and deliberate. Yatza prepared poultices and bandages, her face a mask of grim resolve. Chayton and Claire stood apart from the others, looking out at the distant, skeletal form of the trestle bridge, barely visible in the shimmering heat. "The lock on the safe," Claire said, her voice quiet. "It will be a modern one. A Yale. Most likely. My keys will open it, but only if we have time. We cannot expect to open it on the bridge." "We will not open it there," Chayton confirmed. "We will take the entire safe." The audacity of it settled between them. It was not a simple theft. It was a direct, physical assault on the symbol of Kaldau's power. Claire reached up and touched the yucca bracelet on his wrist, a mirror of her own. The simple, braided fibers were a tangible link between them, a silent promise in the face of impossible odds. Their roles had become perfectly balanced. He was the shield, the quiet strength that would face the guns and the fire. She was the voice, the mind that would wield the truth once it was in their hands. He would provide the cover, and she would lead the charge in the war of words that was to come. As the sun began to set, casting the great wooden trestle in long, sharp shadows, they knew there was no turning back. They were standing on a precipice, a thin line between falling into the abyss of failure and crossing over to a new shore of freedom and justice. Everything, their lives, the future of the Mimbreno people, the secret life she carried within her, would be decided in the fire and the fury that waited for them on the bridge. The night air over Diablo Canyon was thin and cold, but it carried two distinct scents: the sharp, clean smell of pine and the ominous, resinous perfume of the distant forest fire. The trestle bridge was a black skeleton against a sky littered with stars, a man-made intrusion on the vast, silent wilderness. Chaitin and his warriors were shadows among the rocks at the western end of the bridge, their faces grim in the starlight. Across the canyon, Claire watched from a high, sheltered ledge, a spyglass in her hand, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The distant fire was a malevolent glow on the northern horizon, a sleeping dragon that could awaken at any moment. The wind was still for now, but it was a breathless, waiting stillness, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Then they heard it, a low, mournful whistle echoing from the west, followed by the rhythmic, heavy chuffing of a steam engine under strain. The sound grew louder, a mechanical beast climbing the steep grade toward the bridge. A single, bright headlight cut a cone of white through the darkness, illuminating the twin steel rails that ran like silver threads into the night. As the train slowed to a walking pace to begin its careful crossing, Chaitin gave a low signal. His men moved with the fluid silence of hunting cats. Two warriors created a diversion, a rock slide on the tracks far ahead of the train, just beyond the bridge's eastern end. The engineer would see it and stop. The engine crawled onto the wooden trestle, its immense weight making the timbers groan. The single freight car, its doors barred from the outside, followed. As the engineer applied the brakes with a great hiss of steam and screech of metal, Chaitin and Taza swung up onto the car, their moccasins making no sound on the steel ladder. They broke the locks on the door and slid it open. Inside, two guards sat playing cards by the light of a lantern. They looked up, their mouths agape, but they had no time to react. Chaitin and Taza were on them, disarming them with swift, practiced efficiency, binding them with their own belts. In the center of the car, bolted to the floor, was the safe, a squat, black box of iron and steel, impassive and immovable. It was then that the first shot rang out. From the eastern end of the bridge, Sheriff Harlan Pike and 4 deputies emerged from the darkness, their rifles spitting fire. They had not been fooled by the rock slide. They had been waiting. Bullets splintered the wooden walls of the freight car, whining through the air. "Get the safe," Chaitin yelled to Taza. He returned fire, providing cover. The loud report of his Winchester a stark contrast to the quiet efficiency of moments before. The bridge had become a shooting gallery, with no cover but the thin walls of the freight car and the night itself. Claire watched in horror through her spyglass. The plan, so carefully constructed, had shattered into a violent chaos of muzzle flashes and shouting. She saw Chaitin, a pillar of calm in the storm, directing his men. Then, a hand clamped down on her shoulder from behind. She spun around with a cry and found herself looking into the pale, furious eyes of Colt Kaldau. "You!" he hissed, his handsome face twisted into an ugly sneer. He must have been hiding on the train, a passenger on his way to meet his uncle's stolen property. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble. My dear, it is time you made yourself useful." He dragged her from the safety of the ledge, pulling her down the rocky slope and out onto the bridge itself, into the line of fire. "Pike," he screamed, his voice high and strained. "Hold your fire, I have her." The shooting sputtered and died in the sudden, ringing silence. Claire found herself standing in the middle of the trestle, Colt's arm a steel band around her throat, the cold muzzle of a pistol pressed against her temple. Chayton emerged from the freight car, his face a mask of cold fury. "Let her go. Caldow?" "I do not think so," Colt said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "Everyone is going to put their guns down, and you are going to walk away. Leave the safe. Leave the girl. And disappear back into the dirt where you belong." It was at that moment that the wind shifted. A great hot gust swept up the canyon from the north, carrying with it a shower of glowing red embers from the forest fire. They rained down on the bridge like deadly fireflies, landing on the dry, creosote-soaked timbers of the trestle. Small tongues of flame began to lick at the wood, greedily tasting their new fuel. The dragon had awoken. The fire spread with unnatural speed, fanned by the hot, dry wind. The underside of the bridge began to glow. The skeletal timbers transformed into a lattice of fire. Smoke, thick and choking, billowed up, making the scene a hellish tableau of flickering orange light and deep, impenetrable shadows. The train engineer, seeing the bridge turning into an inferno beneath him, blasted the whistle in a long, panicked scream. He could not go forward. He could not go back. He was trapped. The world devolved into a primal chaos, man against man, all of them now pitted against the consuming fury of the fire. In the confusion, Chayton charged, not at Colt, but at Pike, the sheriff. His face, illuminated by the flames, raised his rifle to fire. But Chayton was too fast. He slammed into Pike, and the two men went down, grappling on the burning planks. It was no longer a fight of guns, but of fists and knives and sheer, brutal strength. They rolled through the smoke, two powerful forces locked in a mortal struggle, oblivious to the chasm just inches away. As Chayton and Pike fought, Claire looked into Colt's eyes. She saw not the cool confidence of a captor, but the frantic terror of a cornered rat. The fire was growing. The heat was becoming unbearable, and his plan was literally going up in smoke. "There is no escape for you, Colt," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "Even if you kill us, you will burn with us. Your uncle will not thank you for losing his safe." "Be silent," he shrieked, pressing the gun harder against her head. "Why are you doing this?" she pressed, seeing the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "This is his fight, not yours. You hate him. I have seen it in your eyes. You resent every breath he takes, every order he gives. You are just a tool to him, a pawn in his game." Her words struck a nerve. The truth of them broke through his panic. "He holds all the power," Colt admitted, his voice cracking, the confession torn from him by the heat and the fear. "He treats me like a boy. This safe, these papers, they are his strength. Without them, he is just an old man." "Then let us take them," Claire said, her voice dropping to a persuasive whisper. "Let us take his strength. Help us. Colt, surrender. Live. You can testify against him. You can be the man who brought down Silas Caldow. Think of the power in that." While she spoke, Taza and the other warriors, ignoring the firefight, had been working frantically at the safe, using crowbars to wrench it from its bolts. With a great groan of tortured metal, it came free. They pushed the heavy iron box to the open door of the freight car. At that same moment, Chayton gained the upper hand. He disarmed Pike, the sheriff's pistol skittering across the burning planks. Pike, enraged, lunged at him, but his foot came down on a section of wood that had been weakened by the fire. With a crack of splintering timber and a cry of shock, he plunged through the bridge and disappeared into the fiery, smoke-filled darkness below. Colt saw it happen. He saw his last line of defense vanish into the abyss. He looked at Claire, at the approaching flames, and his resolve crumbled. He let the gun fall from her temple. "All right," he whispered. "All right." "The safe," Chayton yelled, with a final, coordinated heave. Taza and the others pushed the heavy box out of the car. It fell onto the bridge with a thunderous crash. Then they shoved it, slid it, rolled it over the burning planks to the western side, to safety. Jonah appeared from the darkness, his face smeared with soot. "The dynamite is set." Chayton grabbed Colt, pulling him back from the flames. The warriors threw the last of their ropes and gear to the solid ground of the canyon's edge. They scrambled to safety, dragging their prisoner with them, just as Jonah lit the fuse. A few seconds later, a sharp explosion tore through the roar of the fire. A 20-foot section of the track and its supporting timbers on the western approach to the bridge vanished in a shower of splinters and smoke. The train, its brakes screaming, shuddered to a final halt, its front wheels just feet from the new, gaping hole. The crew was safe. The pursuit was cut off. They stood on the edge of the canyon, breathless, scorched, and victorious. The trestle bridge, engulfed in flames, burned with the intensity of a fallen star, a great roaring pyre that consumed the past and illuminated the stark, dangerous path ahead. The fire was a wall between them and Redemption Ridge, a cleansing inferno that had severed their last ties to the old world. They had the safe, they had their proof, they had their prisoner. Chayton looked at Claire, her face smudged with ash, but her eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering light. They had not sought this path of violence, but they had walked it together and emerged from the flames. He looked at the heavy iron box, the repository of so many lies. Vengeance would be easy, but it would not be justice. "We do not dispense the law ourselves," he said, his voice raspy from the smoke, the words a statement of principle in the heart of the chaos. "We take this to the territorial court. We use their own laws to show them what they are." Claire nodded, her hand finding his. They had survived the night of the burning bridge. Now, they had to survive the coming day. The journey to the territorial capital in Prescott was a strange, surreal procession. They traveled not as a war party, but as a delegation bearing a strange and heavy trophy, the iron safe, lashed to a makeshift travois and pulled by 2 sturdy horses. Chayton and a small escort of his most trusted warriors, including a subdued and watchful Taza, rode alongside. Claire rode between them, a woman of 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither, and behind them, his hands bound but his arrogance still clinging to him like a shroud, was Colt Caldau, their prisoner and their star witness. They were a spectacle. Prospectors and settlers stopped and stared as they passed, their expressions a mixture of fear, hatred, and sheer, slack-jawed disbelief. An Apache chief, a runaway white bride, and the nephew of the most powerful man in the territory, all of it revolving around a stolen safe. The story preceded them, carried on the telegraph wires that Jonah had not cut, a garbled, sensational tale that grew with every telling. Prescott was a city of brick and ambition, a place that believed in the rigid lines of law and commerce. To Chayton, it was a forest of straight lines and hard angles, a place as alien as the surface of the moon. They brought their strange cargo not to the sheriff's office, which they knew would be filled with Caldau's sympathizers, but directly to the steps of the territorial courthouse, a grand stone building with pillars that rose like the petrified trees of a long-dead forest. Their arrival caused an immediate uproar, but Chayton did not come with threats. He came with a simple, unassailable demand for justice, a demand that, in the clear light of day and on the steps of the courthouse, could not be easily ignored. The man they were brought before was Judge Isaac Thorne, an appointee from the East, a man known for his stern demeanor and his incorruptible nature. He was old, with a mane of white hair and eyes that seemed to have seen every form of human folly and depravity. He listened, his face impassive, as Chayton laid out the core of their claim, his English careful and precise. He listened as Claire, her voice clear and strong in the cavernous courtroom, told her story. The room was packed. On one side sat the glowering faces of Caldow's foremen and business associates. On the other, a curious mix of townspeople and ranchers who had been hurt by Caldow's chokehold on the valley's resources. And, in the front row, a man with a notepad and a keenly intelligent face sat sketching furiously. He was Elias Reed, a reporter for the New York Herald. Rosa Valdez, true to her word, had sent a telegram before her livery was even a pile of smoldering ash. The story had found its audience. Caldow's lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man from Tucson, immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is a circus. These are unsubstantiated claims from a known hostile and a hysterical woman who has been coerced. The safe is the property of the Black River Dam and Rail Company, stolen in a violent act of banditry." Judge Thorne looked down from his high bench, his expression unreadable. "The court will determine what is and is not substantiated. Counselor, as for the safe, since it is at the center of this dispute, I order it opened. Here, now." A locksmith was summoned. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the delicate, metallic clicks as the man worked on the Yale lock. Claire stepped forward and produced the small brass keys. With the keys and his tools, the locksmith finally turned the last tumbler. The heavy iron door swung open with a deep groan. The contents were brought forth and laid upon the judge's bench. First, the forged deeds. Thick vellum documents with their impressive seals and the elegantly faked signatures. Then, a stack of survey maps. And finally, a thick, leather-bound ledger. Silas Caldow's memory book. Judge Thorne opened the ledger. He began to read, his voice a dry, dispassionate monotone. But the words he read sent ripples of shock through the courtroom. He read a date and a name, Harlan Pike, and a sum of money, noted as for services rendered. He read another date, and another name, Parker, Redemption Ridge Clarion, and a smaller sum, noted as for favorable press. He read name after name, a litany of bribery and corruption that touched every corner of the territory's public life. The memory book was not just evidence. It was a map of the valley's soul, showing every place where it had been bought and sold. The first to break was Parker. The printer, brought to Prescott as a witness for Caldow's lawyer, began to sweat profusely. When the judge called his name, he stumbled to the stand and, with the ledger before him and the reporter's pen scratching away, he confessed everything: the money, the threats, the articles he had been paid to write praising the dam while ignoring the growing thirst of the valley. The final, devastating blow came from Colt Caldow. Brought to the stand in chains, he seemed a different man from the arrogant peacock who had confronted Claire in the street. He was diminished, his fine suit rumpled, his face pale with a mixture of fear and a bitter, long simmering resentment. He looked at his uncle's lawyer, at the men his uncle had paid, and he seemed to make a decision. If he was going to fall, he would not fall alone. He told the court everything. He confirmed that the signatures on the deeds were forgeries, works of art commissioned by his uncle. He described his uncle's contempt for the law, for the Mimbreno people, for anyone who stood in the way of his ambition. He spoke not as a hero, but as a spurned and resentful heir, a man who had finally found a way to wound the uncle who had always treated him as a child. His testimony was a bitter, selfish act of revenge. But it was also the undeniable truth. The case was over. Judge Thorne's gavel came down with a crack that echoed like a rifle shot. He declared the land deeds to be fraudulent. He issued an immediate injunction, halting all work on the dam and ordering the main sluice gate open to restore a temporary, life-saving flow to the Black River. He issued a warrant for the arrest of Silas Caldow on charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. And he called for a full federal investigation into the territory's affairs. A wave of sound washed through the courtroom, cries of joy from the ranchers, shouts of anger from the Caldow men who now faced unemployment. The reporter, Elias Reed, was already sprinting for the telegraph office. The public opinion that had been so carefully controlled by Silas Caldow was about to turn against him like a flash flood. News came late that afternoon. Silas Caldow, having been alerted by a telegraph from his lawyer before the line was seized, had not waited for the law to come to him. He had filled a saddlebag with gold and fled, his trail heading south, toward the lawless borderlands of Mexico. He was gone, a fugitive, but they all knew he was not truly vanquished. His money, his influence, it was a poison that had seeped deep into the bedrock of the territory, and it would not be cleansed overnight. That evening, back in the quiet encampment they had made outside the city, the weight of their victory settled upon Chayton and Claire. The immediate danger was past, but the future was a vast, uncertain landscape. "They hate us," Claire said softly, her hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. She had seen the looks on the faces of the dam workers in the courtroom. "They see us as the people who cost them their livelihoods. What kind of a world will this be for a child to be born into?" Chayton stood beside her, watching the distant lights of the city. He felt the same unease. "Caldow is gone," he said, "but his ghost remains. There will be other men like him, and his money will buy other rifles. Retaliation will come, not with the law, but in the dark." As they stood there, wrestling with their fears, a figure approached them from the shadows. It was Yatza. She had traveled to Prescott with a few of the other women, unwilling to let their men face the white man's world alone. She said nothing, but she held something out to Claire in her open palm. It was a stone, a simple river rock, worn perfectly smooth and dark by 1,000 years of flowing water. It was cool to the touch. "When the news came," Yatza said, her voice a quiet rasp, "I went to the river, the water's flowing again. I found this in the new current." She gently closed Claire's fingers around the stone. "This is the water of the Mimbreno. This is the water of your people, who came across the great sea. It is all one water. This child you carry," she said, her cloudy eyes knowing and kind, "will not be a child of two worlds. It will be a child of this valley, born of the water that you and Chayton have set free. It will be the water of two peoples, joined as one." The simple stone felt as heavy and as profound as a sacred text. It was a blessing, an acceptance, a promise that the child would not be an outcast, but a bridge. The next day, as the sound of the Black River began to swell, a tentative trickle of life returning to the valley, the first meeting took place. It was not in a courtroom or an office, but under the shade of a great cottonwood tree by the river. A few of the local ranchers, a handful of the out-of-work dam employees, Chayton and the Mimbreno elders. They were wary, distrustful, but they were there. They were all thirsty, and they knew they had to find a new way to share the water that had so nearly been lost to them all. With the smooth river stone in her pocket, Claire sat with a pen and a fresh sheet of paper. She was not writing a declaration of war, but a covenant of peace, with Chayton at her side, translating, explaining, and mediating. They began to draft the first lines of a water-sharing agreement, a law born not of a distant government, but of the common thirst of the people who called the valley home. The sound of the river, a gentle, steady rippling, was the only sound that mattered. Justice was flowing again, slow and quiet, but it was flowing. The months that followed the trial were a season of slow, deliberate healing. The Black River, freed from its concrete bonds, ran stronger each day, a silver artery bringing life back to the parched land. The truce between the townspeople, the ranchers, and the Mimbreno was a fragile thing, a sapling in a rocky landscape, but it was alive. It was nurtured by a shared memory of thirst and a common hope for a future that was not dictated by the ghost of Silas Caldow. Their own union was cemented not in a church or a courthouse, but under the vast, rustling canopy of the ancient cottonwood tree that stood sentinel by the river. It was the same tree that had shaded the first difficult meetings about water rights. It was a witness. The ceremony was a simple, quiet affair, attended by Jonah, a smiling Rosa Valdez, and the Membrano elders, Yatza, her face as lined and beautiful as a riverbed in the dry season, officiated. She did not speak of laws or contracts, but of the weaving of paths. Chayton stood before Claire, and instead of a ring, he draped a soft woolen scarf of the deepest forest green around her shoulders, a piece of her own Irish heritage she had kept folded away, a memory of a land she had never seen. She, in turn, reached out and touched the yucca bracelets on both their wrists, the promise made in the trapper's cabin, now reaffirmed before their new, strange, and growing family. There were no grand pronouncements, only the quiet understanding that their lives were now irrevocably intertwined, their roots as deep entangled as those of the great tree above them. The dream Claire had spoken of in the snowy cabin, the foolish dream of a school, began to take root in the healing soil of the valley. It was an idea that spread from person to person, a quiet rebellion against the ignorance that had so nearly destroyed them all. A rancher whose cattle had been saved by the returning water donated a stand of pine from his property. Men who had once worked on the dam, now idle, found a new purpose, their hammers ringing with the sound of construction rather than destruction. Chayton was at the heart of it. He was a natural builder, his hands shaping the raw lumber with a patient and certain strength. Claire watched him, marveling at this other side of the quiet warrior. He was not just a protector, he was a creator. He built the walls that would keep out the winter wind and the benches where the children would sit. He sanded the wood until it was smooth, his calloused hands working with a craftsman's love. He was building the future, one steady plank at a time. When the school was finished, a simple, sturdy building that smelled of fresh pine and possibility. It was a testament to the new valley. It was a single room, but it held a whole world. On the first day, the children came, hesitant at first, a collection of shy, curious faces. There were the dark-eyed Membrano children, the freckle-faced sons and daughters of Irish railroad workers, and the children of Mexican ranchers. They were a living map of the valley's blended bloodlines. It was a school unlike any other. Claire, her belly now gently rounded with the new life she carried, taught reading and writing, her clear voice bringing stories to life from the pages of worn books Rosa had procured from a supplier in Santa Fe. Rosa herself came twice a week to teach Spanish, her laughter filling the small room as she led the children in songs. Jonah Two Feathers, the solitary scout, found a new calling. He did not use a book. He brought the children outside and taught them to read the land itself, to see the story in a bent twig, a faint track in the dust, the flight of a hawk against the blue sky, and sometimes, in the late afternoon, Chayton would come and sit on one of the benches he had built. He would not teach from a book either. He would tell the children stories of the beginning of the world, of the coyote and the eagle, and he would teach them how to listen, how to hear the voice of the water and the language of the wind. The seasons turned. The valley grew stronger. The autumn brought a harvest that was shared by all. The winter was hard, but the fires burned bright in every home, and no one went hungry. The fear of Silas Caldow's return lingered, a shadow at the edge of their peace, a rumor of a vast fortune being gathered south of the border. But it was a fear for another day. For now, there was the work of living. In the spring, when the river was swollen with melted snow from the high peaks and the valley was bursting with new green life, Claire's child was born. The birth was long and difficult, but Yatza was there, her ancient hands steady and sure, her quiet chants a comforting presence in the small dwelling they had built near the river. Chayton stayed by her side, his hand a constant, warm anchor in the storm of her pain. When it was over, a son lay in her arms, healthy and strong, his cry a new and powerful song in the quiet of the dawn. They gave him a name that was a bridge between their two worlds, Liam, a name from the green hills of Ireland, and for his second name, Tio, a word from the Membrano tongue that meant sun, a bringer of light and warmth. Liam Tio, a child of the valley, a child of the water. A few weeks later, after the first warm rain of the season had washed the world clean. Chayton and Claire walked by the river, the baby nestled securely in a carrier on Claire's back. The water was high and clear, rushing over the smooth stones, its voice a happy, constant murmur. They stopped and watched as a flash of silver broke the surface, a trout leaping for a fly. Life had returned in abundance. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the river flow. The source of all their struggle and all their hope. The threat from the south was still real, a darkness that might one day return. The peace they had built was still fragile, a thing that required constant care and attention. But their love, forged in flight and fire, was not fragile. It was as solid and enduring as the stone walls of the forgotten trapper's cabin where it had first truly ignited. It was a shelter, a foundation upon which they would build their future, one day at a time, guided by the steady, life-giving sound of the water. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video, and show your support by pressing the hype button to help this story reach more people.